Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us for another session in our series, Why Marx? Tonight, we're looking at the question of syndicalism, trade unionism, and the limits thereof, and what Marx had to say on the issue, again with Ian Spencer. Thank you, Ian.
Good evening, comrades. In looking at syndicalism, the question is, how does it differ from trade unionism as we normally conceive of it? I mean, we've in the UK in particular, we've just gone through a period of a summer of heightened trade union activity. Is that the same thing? What's the scope? What scope is there for using the trade union to be the organ of revolutionary change? The tendency for those brought up in the tradition of say Trotsky or Lenin is to tend to think of the party and the way in which it's defined, whether narrowly or as a tightly organized group of professional revolutionaries, or in a broader sense, a mass Marxist party, as it were. But there are other traditions, and other traditions which have been, in their own time and for particular reasons, enormously influential. The question is it a very, something which is specific to very particular times and for very particular reasons, or is there the potential for the syndicalist union to form either the very backbone of a revolutionary movement, and can that take place in the absence of a political party? Can it form an alternative to the political party? And some syndicalist organizations have certainly tried. I'm not going to do an exhaustive list of syndicalist organizations, even if I knew about all of them. There were interesting syndicalist organizations in Argentina, for example. There was syndicalist organizations in Germany, for example, but that tends to shade off into what I would suggest is the whole kind of debate around council communism and that kind of thing. So I'll leave that for another session. But for the moment, let's have a look at the idea of a revolutionary union and what the basis of it has been historically. So I've called it one big union because that tended to be the motto of the industrial workers of the world of the United States, which is one of the models that we'll have a look at this evening. So in the sort of division of labor between Marx and Engels, generally speaking, Engels wrote much more about trade unions than Marx. It wasn't simply that Marx wasn't concerned. It was just rather that Engels, with his experience of working as an industrialist in Manchester and his sort of extensive experience with the British labour movement in all its forms, meant that Engels tended to be the kind of resident expert, or tended to be the one that tended to write about trade unions. It also, of course, Frederick Engels had a huge advantage of living longer than Marx and actually got to see changes taking place in the organization of trade unions that Marx didn't live to see. But let's just remind ourselves, and I've mentioned this quote before, that Marx is very clear that trade unions, whilst they're an important adjunct to working class struggle, and in so doing form an invaluable part of the education, the political education of workers, he goes on to argue that instead of the conservative motto, a fair day's wage for a fair day's work, they ought to inscribe on their banner the revolutionary watchword, abolition of the wages system. I don't know how many people were active on picket lines over the course of the summer. As a nurse, I was frequently on picket lines at the hospital in Newcastle, and the idea of a fair day's pay and the extent to which doctors deserve a pay rise above a certain threshold, and at the same time, so there were strange contradictory arguments. On the one hand, there was still this recourse to a fair day's pay given my skill level. So there was a distinction being drawn between skilled workers and unskilled workers, skilled workers being doctors, for example, as opposed to other staffs within the National Health Service, such as nurses or porters or cleaners or whatever else. And this has been something which throughout my entire political life really has been a feature. I remember in 1982, for example, how the 82 health workers dispute was frequently described as the nurses' pay dispute, notwithstanding the fact that most of the nurses who were organised, for example, in the Royal College of Nursing, subsequently went and accepted a pay rise which was greater than the rest of the health service, despite the fact that all the TUC-affiliated unions were arguing for a across-the-board pay rise of 12%. The reason why I mention that is, of course, there's this. There has been a long-standing struggle, as it were, between craft unions and general unions, and generally speaking, the left has been associated with the organisation of general workers' unions, and syndicalism has been organised with regard to general workers' unions, organising workers as workers rather than as doctors or as qualified nurses or as train drivers, as opposed to other people who work on the railways, such as and organised within the RMT union. So we see that those divisions are still there between skilled and unskilled general workers and craft unions. And all of them arguing, in a sense, about the rate of exploitation that should take place for workers, rather than putting forward a case for its abolition. So for Marx, it was clearly a case of arguing for the abolition. Engels, with his extensive experience in Britain, coming as he did to the UK at the tail end of the Chartist movement and observing really the kind of, in 1848, the kind of dying embers, but still quite a vigorous organisation, but coming towards the end of its life in the shape of the Chartist movement, and then seeing the way in which, in living long enough to see what we might call the new unionism of the 1880s. So for Marx, then, there is a big difference to be had between simply haggling over the rate of exploitation and its abolition. The first syndicalism sounds as if it's something. Of course, syndicat is simply the French for union, and syndicalism is simply trade unionism in French. So on one level, there isn't really a great distinction. What we see in France and in other countries is that often particular unions have been associated with political currents of one sort or another. So the CGT, the Confédération Générale du Travail, founded in 1895, initially heavily influenced by the anarcho-syndicalist Émile Pouget, was very much influenced by the anarchism of Proudhon and Bakunin, our old friends that we've seen a few times already. And like Bakunin, the political tactics of the CGT initially, when Pujol was the sort of the vice secretary of the CGT, 1901 to 1908. So, for example, Pouget's sort of longest work is a treatise dedicated to sabotage. In it, he's at pains to point out that this is not the classic image of the sabot, the clog, thrown into the works and causing irreparable damage, but rather sabotage in the sense of the working slow or disrupting in any number of other ways, disabling machinery without actually destroying it. The point about it is, of course, that rather like the politics of Bakunin, this was around actions which could be taken collectively, but also individually. And what's interesting about it is embracing notions around sabotage and working slowly as an important union tactic. The foundation of the CGT was an important movement for the French workers, and of course, as you see from its dates, as it were, it coincides with the development of the French Workers' Party. And the relationship of the French Workers' Party is an important feature of the CGT's history. So by 1909, Léon Jouot had become the General Secretary of the CGT and constituted a feature that we've seen so many times in both political parties, such as the Parti Ouvrier of France and elsewhere, the idea of a reformist General Secretary. And of course, what we find today in many of our unions is that there are very few that stand out as being led, in a sense, by people informed by a Marxist perspective. So Jean supported the Union Sacrée, the idea that somehow workers should support the war effort, not engage in industrial action, and should subordinate the demands of the working class to the important, and of course, and it was to the interests of the nation as a whole. In so doing, he was doing the same as we'd already seen in the Labour Party in Britain and the French Workers' Party, and of course in Germany, the idea that you get behind your own national bourgeoisie, and often justified in pseudo-radical terms against the autocratic nature of Germany, for example, or against the autocratic nature of Russia. There was a split in the CGT in 1920 because, of course, by then the Russian Revolution had posed a really quite a different political imperative to the workers of France, and the CGTU split away and was expressly linked to the Communist Party of France. They reunited in 1936, but after the Second World War, the CGT, largely on the basis of the enormous prestige gained by the Communist Party of France, for the leading role it had played in the resistance, came to play a leading role in the CGT itself, and for a long time, the Communist Party of France played a leading role within the CGT. The split, apart from the CGTU was dominated by the Communist Party, and what remained of the CGT was allied with the French Socialist Party. Jean himself later formed another organization which was more conservative again, and was determined to try and resist the drift of the CGT and of the French working class into the influence of the Communist Party, and for that, in 1951, received, apart from anything else, the Nobel Peace Prize. People who take conservative positions often do get the trinkets that they so covet in their lives. Turning now to Spain and the CNT, the Confederación Nacional del Trabajo, can trace its origins back really to the Spanish chapter of the International Working Men's Association, which was largely based in Madrid in 1870. And indeed, even after the foundation of the CNT in 1910 in Barcelona, the only place where there was a Marxist influence in the CNT was in its Madrid branches, but that didn't last long, and most of the Marxists were effectively purged from the CNT. The CNT was and is affiliated to the International Workers' Association. Remember, there was the split in the first international, and effectively the anarchists set up their own international. So we have two affiliations really. The kind of anarchist international, as it were, the International Workers' Association, and the Federation Federación Anarquista Ibérica, the FAI, and often you'll see the two linked together, CNT, FAI, and again we see this split in between an anarchist tendency going right back to the first international and a Marxist tendency. So the UGT, Unión General de Trabajadores, UGT, founded in 1888, and was affiliated to the Spanish Socialist Workers' Party, which was founded in 1879. And it's that very same Spanish Socialist Party which is in office today, but a far cry from its Marxist beginnings. I've actually drank in the bar where this, where the Spanish, you'll be surprised to learn, Spanish Socialist Workers' Party was founded in 1879, and there is actually a plaque on the wall. So the Federación Anarquista Ibérica, founded in Valencia in 1927, as the name suggests, includes both Spain and Portugal, but there is a separate anarchist organization in Portugal. We don't really know. There are no published membership figures for the anarchist organizations in the Iberian Peninsula, as far as I'm aware. However, by 1934, membership of the CNT was 1.58 million, which is quite extraordinary in a country where it was still formally illegal. It was operating under conditions of where many of the members were extremely poor, in rural areas with difficulties of communication, but its growth really was almost to that sort of size was almost directly related to the founding of the Second Spanish Republic in 1931. By 1936, they were legalized. You would have thought they could have done that a bit sooner, and it provided a substantial anarchist militia to fight against Franco, and its journal Tierra y Libertad is, of course, also the title given to that magnificent film by Ken Loach of the same title, Land and Liberty, Land and Freedom. And of course, it was something that cropped up, you'll recall, from the Narodnaya Volya group, the idea of land and freedom as a key demand of the anarchist movement, giving an indication really of what the base of the anarchist movement in Spain was at the time. The majority of the population were not industrial proletarians, although Barcelona and Madrid and other places had significant proletarian numbers. But many of the members of the CNT FAI were the peasants, and often extremely poor ones, and throughout the Iberian Peninsula, people worked under horrible conditions in terms of, although formally not feudal, they were operating under conditions which were, to all intents and purposes, still effectively feudal, where landowners had complete control over not just the nature of the land, but the operations of the state, both locally and nationally. And therefore, the Second Spanish Republic posed a huge threat to the landowning class. It's an important feature of this time, of course. There's a tendency among some people, and for understandable reasons, to call people they don't like fascists or Nazis or whatever. I think one of the very important observations that made by Trotsky was that the reason why you have fascism in countries such as Germany, Italy, Spain, and indeed Portugal, was because it was allied to a threatened petty bourgeoisie, and also a landowning class caught as it was between a potentially militant industrial proletariat and an haute bourgeoisie as well, an internationalist haute bourgeoisie that could threaten the national interests of small commodity producers and landowners. So we see that the social base for Franco's fascism was very firmly rooted in the landowning classes. And it's not at all unusual and not at all surprising that where the Phalange, the fascists, gained most support was often in rural areas, and of course from the church. So I'm not in a position really to talk about the Spanish Civil War, and the aim wasn't really to go that far off into history. I just wanted to make one observation, though. If you read George Orwell's Homage to Catalonia, George Orwell, who was a member of the Independent Labour Party, served in the PUM militia, Partido Obrero Unificación Marxistas. So he served in the PUM militia because there was an association between that and the ILP. And he happened to be in Barcelona, was swept along by the enthusiasm for the revolution that was taking place as part of the Second Spanish Republic, and joined the PUM militia. And later on, he tried to join the International Brigade, but because he wasn't a member of the Communist Party, that was quite difficult. So all of the organizations that were belligerent in the Spanish Civil War had their own militias, and this is an important feature because remember, if you go back to the discussion around the Paris Commune, what we as communists would stand for is the idea of the workers in arms rather than the idea of a standing army which can rise above working people and dominate it, as indeed does the state. But one of the interesting things about most of the CNT in particular was that it had its own militia, and so did the PUM, and so did the Socialist Party, and that was a feature of the Spanish Civil War. Crossing the Atlantic, so we're hopping about a bit in terms of time, but I wanted to pay a little bit of attention to the industrial workers of the world, the Wobblies. The Wobblies' own website is on the question of why they got their name, the Wobblies, says nobody actually knows. But the most widely quoted reason is that the IWW were unusual from their inception in that they organized all workers, irrespective of gender, irrespective of nationality. There were, at the time, large numbers of Chinese workers building the railroads. And the Wobblies allegedly came from the fact that Chinese workers couldn't pronounce W. So I wobbly wobble, and therefore they became the Wobblies. There are other explanations, but that's the most often heard. So founded in Chicago in 1905, I put down, as far as I can make out, they reached their peak membership of about 150,000 members, mostly in the USA. And this is an interesting one because other claims go into the millions, but, and it's an important qualification, the 150,000 is based on people who actually paid their subs. The millions, apparently, people, the membership of the IWW could fluctuate enormously and probably had a very high membership between about 1905 and 1910. But many of those would have been notional members. They hadn't paid their subs, or they couldn't pay their subs because they were desperately poor. and therefore notionally some accounts put the IWW membership in the millions. However, the most reliable thing, the most reliable estimate of their peak membership of people who are actually paying their subs in 1917 was 150,000 members, and most of those were in the USA, although they did have branches elsewhere, including in the UK, where, for example, the Atlantic trade meant that they had members among longshoremen in Liverpool. And so here are some of the founding members. Women were very active in the IWW as well, and played an important role, and indeed leading role. But I just wanted to mention these particular people because they played a part, as it were, in some of the splits that took place, and indeed some of the continuation of the syndicalist movement worldwide. Big Bill Haywood, those are his dates, one of the few Americans buried in the Kremlin wall, because he escaped to the Soviet Union as a political refugee following a court case in the United States. James Connolly, who I'll come on to, of course, James Connolly is thought of as really the greatest of his generation in terms of not only Irish republicanism, but as both a syndicalist and as a Marxist. And here, really, we come to an important feature about a discussion of syndicalism. In talking about the CNT in Spain, there is still a kind of noticeable division between the idea of syndicalism as something which is distinct from socialism or Marxism. So an idea of an opposition to a centralized organization, a principled opposition. And we've seen this when we talked about Marx in his discussion with the anarchists, particularly of Friedrich Engels' critique of the Bakuninists and their actions during the First Spanish Republic, of a tendency to operate on the basis of sudden insurrections, individual acts of insurrection on a small scale, and not playing a full part in, for example, elections with disastrous consequences. Those same divisions existed within the IWW. Do we take part in politics, as it were, or is the only way in which we can bring about socialism by the action of workers themselves organizing in one big union? Bill Haywood, for example, was very much of the opinion that it should be very much on the basis of industrial organization, rather than try to put forward a party program. By contrast, Daniel de Leon and Eugene Debs, James Connolly, I think, was in the Socialist Labour Party of America, as was Daniel de Leon. Eugene Debs was a Socialist Party of America candidate, I think 5 times for the presidency of the USA. And it's, I think on at least one occasion, he got something like 3.5% of the total vote. So what we see in the IWW then is a mixture, really, of Marxists, socialists of one sort or another, and anarchists. Its truly striking feature was that at a time when the American Federation of Labor was only prepared to organize, among skilled workers and among craft unionists, the IWW were recruiting everybody. There was no distinction between black or Chinese or white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. They would organize everyone. An interesting feature of the CNT, even today, is that you can't join the CNT in Spain if you are a prison officer or a police officer or an employer in any way, shape, or form. They drew a sharp distinction between agents of the state and exploiters and the exploited. The IWW had this awkward relationship with political parties, and one could argue that the peak of 1917 is by no means accidental. That by 1917, the imperative of political parties that were forming in the United States and becoming increasingly powerful in the United States led in part to the IWW's decline. Only in part, because the other part was massive state repression. Those of you who, like me, adore the music of Paul Robeson will love his rendition of the Ballad of Joe Hill. Joe Hill was a member of the IWW, a Swedish worker. Apparently, a sizable proportion of IWW members were from Scandinavia. And of course, Joe Hill was eventually executed by a firing squad. And a number of IWW members, including Bill Hayward, ended up in court. Eugene Debs himself served time in prison, often on spurious, trumped-up charges or with relatively little evidence. But like the CNT, the IWW embraced the importance of the general strike as a weapon and also of sabotage. And again, I'm not here talking about the absolute destruction of machinery, but of the go slow, the temporary disabling of machinery. However, the IWW did have a number of their comrades arrested because they had set fire to fields of grain as a political act. So the conflict here is not only between capital and labor, but there is also a pitched battle really being fought with the American Federation of Labor. And if you think left-wing parties are somewhat fissile, there's a tendency to split, the syndicalist organizations were no less so. There was a split in 1908, and Daniel de Leon was organizing within the Socialist Labour Party. There was a debate between James Connolly and Daniel de Leon about the interpretation of Lassalle's iron law of wages. But that wasn't the only problem. So by 1917, of course, you've got the Russian Revolution, and actually in the period after about 1920, most of the people who were on the left, such as John Reed, and had gone off into the Communist Party. I've mentioned a little bit before about the kind of new unionism that was so widely written about by Friedrich Engels. I don't want to here imply that Eleanor Marx or Annie Besant were in any way syndicalists. I've simply included them here because of their importance in the 1888 Bryant and May Match Girls strike. The important thing about that was, of course, here were young women and in fact teenage girls who were engaged in militant trade union activity, and this is a different type of unionism to what Marx would have understood or had seen in his lifetime. And it was really Engels that then subsequently wrote about the way in which the British trade union movement was moving in a more radical direction, because it was organizing on the basis of general workers' unions. Tom Mann, who was a member of the Social Democratic Federation, as indeed was Eleanor Marx, and I've covered the conflicts they had there with Hindman. Tom Mann also founded the Industrial Syndicalist Education League and wrote for a newspaper called the Industrial Syndicalist between 1910 and 1911. And like many in the IWW, supported the Russian Revolution and maintained a revolutionary Marxist position. So we see in Tom Mann not really a contradiction between syndicalism and socialism, but rather his radicalism was expressed in a syndicalist form at a particular time, and just in the same way that the CNT in Spain reached its peak in the fight against fascism. Syndicalism in the context of the USA reached a peak in the period before the Industrial Revolution, the Russian Revolution. The new unionism in the UK, of course, as we know, Tom Mann, along with Ben Tillett, were instrumental in organising dock strikes, both in London and Liverpool, and of course the founding of the Transport and General Workers Union in 1922, a seminal moment in terms of general workers' unions. Which brings me neatly on to James Connolly, and I'm kind of embarrassed really that he isn't getting a fuller treatment here, because obviously the contribution of James Connolly, his collected works run to a good, well, the edition I've got anyway is 2 volumes, and a great writer, and a clearly deeply imbued with Marxist thoughts. Although one can have a critical perspective on his involvement with Irish nationalism and indeed syndicalism. Nevertheless, here's just a list of just a few of his lifelong involvement. He born in Edinburgh to Irish parents, served in the British Army and absolutely hated it. When he found out that his regiment was due to be posted to India, quite reasonably deserted. And was never ceased to be actively involved. We tend to think of Connolly as someone who was martyred as an Irish nationalist, but he was first and foremost a socialist, and first and foremost a revolutionary. He emigrated to the USA in 1903, and apart from other organizations, also joined the IWW in 1909, and had these kind of debates with Daniel de Leon, for example, before returning to Ireland in 1910, and ultimately to be executed at the hands of the British in 1916. And here's James Larkin, born in Liverpool, again to Irish parents. Liverpool is very much an Irish city in many respects. Along with Connolly, established the Irish Transport and General Workers Union, which was no part of the British Transport and General Workers Union, which was organised under another name in Ireland. So, along with Connolly, helped to found the Irish Labour Party in 1912, and so the Dublin lockout of 1913. The poverty of workers in Dublin was extraordinary by any standards in Europe, and particularly, I mean, when one considers this was a full part of the United Kingdom at the time, the standards the standards of living endured by the Irish workers was very poor indeed, and they tried to organise a union within the context of the docks in Dublin, and of course, and other industries, and being effectively locked out. And it was a fight for union recognition, and unfortunately one which was lost. However, during this, the Larkin and Connolly had founded the Irish Citizen Army, and of course it was the Irish Citizen Army that would later play an important part in the 1916 uprising in Dublin. So Larkin also founded the Irish Workers' League in 1923, which was affiliated to the Third International. So Larkin, although in many ways, like Connolly, a syndicalist, using the union to great effect, both to try and demand improvements for workers' rights and pay, nevertheless didn't hesitate to use it to put forward political demands. And from that point of view, the Irish Transport and General Workers Union was nothing like the British Transport and General Workers Union. In fact, the Dublin lockout was ultimately, one could argue, defeated by the failure of the British TUC to render the kind of international solidarity that one would have expected. So 1924, Larkin attended the 5th Comintern Congress, but ultimately became a member of Parliament in the Dáil. Founded the Workers' Union of Ireland, and finally died in 1947. In conclusion, then, what I've tried to do is point out the contradictions, the interrelationship between party and trade union. I would argue that without revolutionaries, you can't have revolutions, and moreover, revolutions also make revolutionaries, in the sense that the conditions under which people are operating often change the form taken by the organizations that they adhere to and develop. And particular revolutionary situations, or particular political situations, particular economic situations, throw up particular types of organization. But the high watermark of syndicalism took place in different countries for very different reasons. And just as its flood tide happened for particular reasons, so did its ebb tide. Right, comrades, thank you.
Thank you very much, Comrade Ian, as always. Comrades, if you have any questions or contributions, please click raise hand. And I'm just going to start off by asking you a few questions, as always. I think you've given a good overview of the sort of syndicalist movement, etc. Let's try and go a bit back to Marx, perhaps, and his. I mean, he wrote loads as well about various trade union struggles and waves. You know, he wrote for various papers as a journalist as well, as a political critic. But he did. I mean, the point of trade unions, of course, is they come from capitalism, and that they are a creation by capitalism. Capitalism throws up the working class. It creates the working class. The working class get into conflict with the bourgeoisie, first as individuals, as you described, and then more and more they organize and get together in trade unions, etc. As Marx wrote, trade unions are the proletariat's true self-class organization in which it fights its daily battles with capital and which it trains itself. So it learns who its enemy is. It learns concretely, you know, that he has to train himself, and he has to train himself to take on the capitalists, etc. But he also wrote, he was quite critical of trade unions, saying, in their present, and that was 150 years ago, in their present form, they're often too exclusively bent upon the local and immediate struggles with capital, and the trade unions have not yet fully understood their power of acting against the system of wage slavery itself, as you said. And he describes it as the future. The future, basically, they would be centers of the working class in the broad interest of the complete emancipation of the working class. They must aid every social and political movement tending in that direction, etc. And crucially, they have to be international. And that's an interesting question, because that's not really happening much today. There is the European Trade Union Congress, but it is a very sorry organization. On that question, then, I mean, they are very important for workers. You know, you learn your trade, basically. You learn that you're a worker, and you learn that you're in battle against capital. But unions as well are very much part of capitalism and part of the limits of capitalism. And do you see, sort of, in a future society, you know, that is going beyond capitalism, are there trade unions as such? Would they have changed massively? Is that perhaps an issue, you know, that leads to some trade union leaders holding back and, you know, not trying to descend capitalism, because, you know, without capitalism, you kind of, trade union leaders are out of a job. Is that an issue? You're muted, correct? Sorry.
I switched that off because I was coughing my head off. There is that constant tension. I mean, one thing about the IWW was that it was a genuine attempt at an internationalist union, although it was very much an internationalist union without necessarily a stated kind of party program, as it were. The question is, from the syndicalist point of view, particularly in the IWW, the idea would be that the trade unions would have a part in managing the new society, as it were. This, of course, also came up during the Russian Revolution, and the importance of maintaining independence for the trade unions. To what extent would trade unions play a part in actually helping to run the industries in a new socialist society in that interim period between kind of a lower phase of socialism and a higher phase of socialism? And that's been an important part of it. I would also add, yes, of course, trade unions are the creation of capitalism, as indeed is the proletariat. But of course, so are parties. And what we do tend to see is people arguing that the form taken by the party is a form thrown up by bourgeois society, and as such, maybe a completely different form of organization is required, or that the party itself is so tied to state forms. And of course, therefore, you tend to see this put forward by anarchist syndicalist unions and that kind of thing, that therefore the true expression of the workers themselves is actually in the syndicate, in the trade union, in the workers' organization. The problem is for us, of course, is that isn't our experience at all. I mean, you know, the trade unions have, for the most part, become little more than specialist branches of human relations departments, or human resources departments, human remains, as I like to think of them, and have become intrinsically conservative. Whether they would be transformed in a revolutionary time is something we'll have to wait and see. But I certainly didn't see too many trade union banners out for Palestine solidarity, never mind solidarity with any other groups of workers anywhere in Europe or anywhere in the world.
That's an interesting one, isn't it? There's I think it's the FBU and maybe one other union that has dared to come out in solidarity with the Palestinians, or, you know, even calling for a ceasefire is now a revolutionary demand, which is absolutely outrageous. It also touches on the question of labor aristocracy, which Marx wrote about, and which I would like to ask you if that you think, is that still an issue? I think it is still an issue, and we have seen that in some disputes around Brexit question as well, and around some disputes where, you know, internationally workers are competing perhaps for the same jobs. And there is a question then of wages undercutting internationally, of, you know, British jobs for British workers, which was something that shamefully a lot of lefties and trade unionists supported. Obviously touches then on immigration controls, etc. The idea, though, could you outline Marx's idea of labor aristocracy, and if that is still an issue 150 years later?
Probably more so, but I mean, it is interesting because you know, the usual caricature of Marx is that somehow there was just the question of the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. But of course, Marx, if you go through his work, always and everywhere aware that there are privileged sections of the working class. Marx and Engels are both aware of the important impact of imperialism and the fact that British workers were privileged. And as we've seen, for example, in the Dublin lockout, Irish workers, brother, you know, the close interrelationship between British and Irish workers was, I mean, Connolly was born in Edinburgh, Larkin was born in Liverpool. Even that didn't mean that the British TUC would render any kind of help to their brothers in Ireland. Never mind in parts of the rest of the empire or anywhere else. Were perfectly happy to enjoy their privileges at the expense of Indian workers whose industries were being impaired throughout the whole period of the British Raj. So yes, labour aristocracy, and labour aristocracy on the back of British imperialism, I think I would be inclined to argue. Um, and I think there is still the question of that labour aristocracy. I mean, you see it in even in my own areas. I mean, nurses who have historically never even been paid at a level which is commensurate with skilled manual labour would still tend to defend their interests. I mean, talking about qualified nurses here, defend their interests against incursion by care workers, support workers, and so they're not allowed to use the term nurse, for example. And increasingly, that's breaking down, and a lot of it's dependent upon the level of class struggle, the extent to which the ruling class is able to buy off one section of the proletariat against another. It's not, I mean, if ever you get the opportunity to wander around Belfast, please do. A wonderful city, and you can go and find up on the Falls Road an unprepossessing little terraced house just a couple of doors along from a dentist's where James Connolly lived. And it's not accidental that both James Connolly and Larkin had spent time in Belfast. They were able to see the way in which the workers were divided between Protestant and Catholic, and were painfully aware of that. So labour aristocracy, absolutely. I mean, even the logical inheritor of the Irish and Transport General Workers Union, SIPTU, only, I mean, it does have branches in the north, but most of its workers are in the south.
I mean, this is internationalism is becoming a hugely more, the closer capitalism gets together, the more our forces have to unite in order to be able to fight back. I mean, it seems an obvious one, and yet, as you described, there is a tendency to, so play workers off against each other, not just locally, nationally, but also internationally, and seems to be the only real answer we can have in terms of anti-refugee sentiments, etc., anti-foreign sentiment, is to call for international trade unionism, which is hugely important, but it's unfortunately much ignored issue, unfortunately, and it's still being played off against each other. Look a quick look then at the question between the trade unions and the Labour Party, the Communist Party, etc., which is an interesting one. Coming from Germany, it was quite different. In Germany, it was the Social Democratic Party which helped launch some of the unions, or in parallel. In Britain, it was quite different. In Britain, it was the unions that founded the Labour Party, which perhaps explains some Labour Party being a bit more conservative and some of the unions being a bit more conservative. Do you think there's a difference between how these things played out and what the relation is between the Labour Party and unions, and what it should be?
Certainly in terms of the conservatism of British trade unions being bound hand and foot to the Labour Party. In other countries, it's not quite the same. I mean, the CNT in Spain now is a fraction of what it was. I mean, it is just but obviously during the period of the first Spanish Republic and the Civil War, played an enormous role. And although Orwell was in the poem, he says in Homage to Catalonia, I'm glad I spent my time among Trotskyists and anarchists and not with the Communist Party, because the Communist Party constituted a conservative force. But of course, that's the Communist Party of Stalin. A Communist Party of Spain that was really just an adjunct to Soviet foreign policy, and absolutely determined to make sure socialism doesn't break out and revolution isn't advanced. Demands for revolution are not advanced in Spain, because then it could spread to France and beyond. The interrelationship between political parties and those kinds of political demands and trade unions is absolutely crucial. And I don't, and you struggle to find any kind of significant trade union leader who has even the inkling of a political perspective.
No, it's definitely taken out of trade unionism at the moment, isn't it? It used to be more political, but
and where you see it, it's, if anything, it's firmly in the hands of Stalinists. So you see that the Morning Star becomes, you know, the newspaper of choice for the labour and trade union bureaucracy.
There's obviously a huge, that's my last question now to you, there's the huge question of democratic deficits in the trade union movement, as there is in the labor movement. I mean, you get, you know, you elect the general secretary, but then he or she you know, installs a whole layer of bureaucrats who are not elected and who basically, you know, run their own little fiefdoms often, and you have a lack of decision making, etc., for those below. And it's, I mean, it's best reflected at Labour Party conference when you have, you know, they're putting up their hands as they're told by their general secretary. The delegates of the trade unions can't vote for themselves. They have to vote how they're being told. So they might as well stay home and just bring the cards. So that needs democratizing massively as well. That brings me to the question of I was going to ask you, sorry.
Just on that point, I mean, it works the other way as well. I mean, I was present at the selection of Mary Foy as as the prospective parliamentary candidate for the Labour Party in Durham, and she was a Unison place person. So having won the backing of Unison, she was sort of put in as and no credible alternative put up against her. So you can end up the union controlling who becomes the political representative. Absolutely.
But I was going to mention on that question, there is a demand, or there's a trend, and it's an old standing one. It's you know, that to oppose this kind of apolitical trade unionism and the kind of the question of, you know, the bureaucrats, etc., will have a trade union that is pure, you know, a communist trade union, a revolutionary trade union that goes beyond the sort of, you know, the trades, but it just combines people who have the same political viewpoints. What do you think about those kind of political trade unions? Sounds good.
Well, of course, and it became a feature particularly of the German Revolution, when the Communist Party of Germany split, and there was the Communist Workers' Party of Germany also formed. So you ended up with, you know, the council communists, people like Gorter and of course Anton Pannekoek, although he was Dutch, and you ended up with the German General Workers' Union. And the idea was the German General Workers' Union would be the authentic expression of the interests of the working class, allied with the workers' councils. The problem with that was it was defeated, and it was defeated precisely because of the divisions. And it's a particular problem because, of course, people like Liebknecht and Luxemburg were shouted down, but Liebknecht in particular was shouted down because of a demand for unity. And demand for unity on the basis of what was supposed to be the unifying force of the German Social Democratic Party. It was necessary to split from the German Social Democratic Party. But of course, eventually you ended up with the German Communist Party also splitting. And you end up with the German Communist Workers' Party and allied with the German General Workers' Union. And the outcome was defeat.
I mean, for communists, I'd say, though, their job in trade unions is not to be necessarily the best trade unionist, but to be a communist in the trade union. You argue for communist politics, but the point is not to argue just with people who believe it already, but you want to influence people, isn't it? That's why communists actually prefer trade unions of the class. We want to argue with the working class at the workplaces where we can probably get to them the best. And we don't want, you know, we don't want to break off trade unions, do we? We actually want big trade unions. We do want the whole working class in one trade union would be ideal.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, then a couple of questions from the floor. I'm just going to read out a couple before I bring in William and Carol. Apologies, comrades. otherwise the chat vanishes and I can't see it anymore. John Fitzgerald's asking, can you, oh no, he says, he thinks Trotsky said trade unions are the policemen of the working class. Haven't heard that one. Do you know about that quote? Trade unions are the policemen.
I'm not familiar with that. I mean, that to a certain extent is a good description of what's happening at the moment, but I don't recall it ever being attributed to Trotsky, but that maybe says more about what I've read than anything else.
John, if you want to ask that or say anything more about this, please click raise hand or put it in the chat and I'll bring you in. Pam's asking, can you say more about Marx writing about the demand for the abolition of the wages system?
Yeah, it's a sort of elementary feature of what Marx is demanding is the end of commodity production, so that all production is solely to meet human need. So as we're not making commodities anymore, we're not selling our labor power. Our labor power ceases to be a commodity. The idea is that, and this is more fully discussed in the Critique of the Gotha program, for example, where Marx is talking about a situation where you could have, at the time he's talking where you could have labor certificates. So you go to work, you get your labor certificate, and that allows you to draw so much from the common storehouse, as it were, that we all have access to. There would be a requirement to do necessary labor. Someone's still got to go down the drain. Someone's still got to look after old people or do whatever you have to do. But nevertheless, so we still have to work at least for a time. But when you think of all the jobs that are completely pointless, don't actually create any new value, like banking, insurance, or all that kind of stuff, the army, police force, and all the rest of it, they don't create, they don't necessarily meet human need. All production is to meet human need. So you could very quickly end up with a working week of about 10 hours. And the rest of the time you can develop yourself in any way you want. So that the ultimate idea is that you abolish wages altogether. And even that idea of labor certificates, which would is completely surpassed now, but actually is becoming a feature, isn't it? Who uses cash anymore? I very rarely ever use the stuff. Your little swipe card or whatever. It's very easy. You can see how that would. You could have a relatively smooth transition from a cashless economy into a money-free economy. Money is itself merely a universal commodity, as it were.
Thank you for that. William was first. Welcome, comrade.
Right, well, I must say I enjoyed the lecture, and I'm not going to deal with Spain or Portugal or Germany. I'm going to deal with Ireland, James Connolly, and America. And that's because it's not only my national history, it's also my family history. I am a grandson of an Irish Citizen Army volunteer. And both my grandparents knew James Connolly personally. And I only knew one of my grandparents, that was my granny, and she was able to fill me in an awful lot about what kind of a man he was and the size of him and one thing and another. Now, in America, he developed his trade unionism, which was industrial trade unionism, the industrial workers of the world. He was opposed, he understood the limitations of craft unionism, which he found to be chauvinistic, one thing and another. And he was a main organizer for a lot of industrial disputes when he was in America. And he was one of the people who promoted Elizabeth Gully Flynn. He caught her, he recognized her talent as a 17-year-old, and he made sure that whenever there was labor meetings or labor ceremonies like May Day, that she would speak because she was such a brilliant speaker. Now, he got back to Ireland, as you say, in 1910, and he got a job off James Larkin, who founded the Irish Transport and General Workers Union. Larkin was after breaking away from the British Union and took the Irish money that they had contributed into the funds, and subsequently ended up getting 6 months hard labour. for misappropriating union funds. But he said he didn't misappropriate it. He was only using it for what the members wanted him to use it for, but the law of the land took a different view, and Larkin ended up in jail. As for they led the Dublin lockout, that started in 1913. It started in the second week of August in 1913, and it went on for 8 months and 2 weeks, and then it ended in defeat for the workers. Now, the craft unions, of which my grandfather would have been a member of one, supported the general workers on that to a great extent. The building industry were the first industry to go back to work, and then the dockers went back to work, and that broke Larkin's. He went into a very deep state of depression and melancholia after that. The last people to go back, and they're written out of history, and I think it's sad because some females should do the research on them, where the women workers in the Jacobs biscuit factory, 3,000 of them, they stood out for 6 weeks longer. Now, it was actually Connolly that convinced them to go back. And the speech he gave, and I've seen copies of it, he was saying, look, there's no point in continuing, you're not going to win. You just have to make it a great show, and don't consider it as a defeat. Consider it as a stalemate. You inflicted enough pain on some of the most unscrupulous employers in this city that they have now gone out of business. And it's only the major ones, like the William Martin Murphy ones. And William Martin Murphy was the main industrial. He owned the tram lines, he owned everything else, he owned lots of things. He didn't own Jacobs. Jacobs was actually owned by the Quakers. And they didn't, they let themselves down because they were usually a pretty good employer, but they let themselves down. So Larkin got them to go back. And he did tell them, he said there'll be another fight. And the next time it won't be pickets, it'll be guns. About 6 weeks after he made that speech, the First World War broke out. And everything, he explained to them that the next war is going to be a mechanical war, and it's going to be an industrialized war, and the casualties are going to be greater than any other war that ever took place before. And everything he said was true. Now, I know an awful lot of people, especially in the British left, condemn Connolly for taking up arms against the British Empire and aligning himself with bourgeois nationalists, but he didn't really. He only aligned himself with romantic Irish bourgeois, which didn't really have any economic force in the country at the time. They were artists and playwrights and poets and people like that. And that's who he aligned himself with. And the issue was, do we go into the war? Now, the British labour movement and all the other labour movements in Europe, including the German labour movement, went in on the side of their national governments. And the only people that stood out against that was the Russian labour movement and the Irish labour movement. And that is the reason why Connolly is supported by Lenin. Now, Trotsky totally condemned Connolly, but Lenin knew differently. Lenin had a greater understanding of Marxism than Trotsky, and he supported Connolly all the way. Now, as for Larkin wasn't very politically educated at that time at all, and Connolly wanted to get him offside, so he got him a job in America, and he went over to America, and he ended up getting arrested and getting jailed. I think he got a 10-year jail sentence, And of course, it was a trumped-up charge, no evidence at all. Now, I'll finish on this. The greatest commemoration after the execution of Connolly was in Butte, Montana. Butte, Montana was an open-cast copper mine organized by the IWW on a bonus system. And you got paid by the tonnage that you filled up your bar with it, and you went, and people earned a fortune. It was a boom town. Now, the IWW took the view that they went on strike when the war was declared, and they weren't going to mine, because if they said that the iron or the copper ore would have been mixed with tin, and it would have been used for making bullets, and it would the cases for bullets would have been, and they weren't doing that because that was putting workers against workers. Now, so much so that the American government had to go to Chile and get the copper that they needed for the armaments. 2 seconds, I know. Sorry for being a nuisance. And in the end, when the war was over, now Elizabeth Gawley Flynn spoke at that. She gave the oration in Butte, Montana. Then, what killed the IWW in America was when the war was over, the Montana National Guard came back from the front in Europe and were told to go in and deal with the rebels who caused the strike. The Wobblies were waiting for them, and there was a battle there that went on for the whole week. And then an Irish priest went in and organized a ceasefire, and that's then the ceasefire was it's going to be no more charges if they put down their arms and they left. That'd be the end of it, and that's exactly what happened. So that was the end of the IWW. They did survive, and they're still there now, but they did survive a little bit after that, but they never had the strength they had before. So, sorry for being too long and long-winded.
No, not at all. I'd love to hear you do a whole session on Connolly, to be perfectly honest. Of course, not only should Connolly not be condemned for taking up arms against the British Army, to be congratulated. It's just a pity he didn't do it a year later, but there we go.
Yeah, well, that's the whole point that Lenin said. Lenin said you went too far. You should have waited, but it's just always after the event. You see, Lenin would have thought that a revolution in Ireland against the war would have led to a revolution in Britain against the war, and that's was the thinking behind of Lenin, and that's what he said, that he went too early.
Of course, the great sadness was that the uprising in 1916 had very little popular support at the time. And the tragic, well, of course, what then happened was the brutal execution of the Irish volunteers meant, well, the outcome was an almost clean sweep for Sinn Féin throughout the Ireland, except in what we now think of as Northern Ireland.
Not even that, only to drive Antrim and Down, only 2 counties in Northern Ireland.
Indeed. And there was an instruction that they were not to shoot any more Irish Republicans. The only exception they made was for Roger Casement, who of course helped provide the rifles. It helped to.
Yeah, they hanged him. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. It's brilliant.
Okay.
Thank you, correct. Carol, please.
Yes. Actually, a little aside to what you're saying, William. When Sylvia Pankhurst went on stage at the Albert Hall to support James Connolly, because James Larkin was in prison then, and James Connolly was trying to get the TUC to support the TGWU in Ireland, and she was promptly expelled from the suffragettes by her sister Christabel for support for the Irish trade unionists then. But my question, that was just a little aside, my question was, I was really interested, Ian, when you said that the rise of fascism in Spain and Italy and Germany was as a result of some of these trade union organizations arising. I found that very interesting. Could you say a bit more about that?
Yeah, I think there was a widespread fear that of the possibility of a communist revolution. I mean, in the context of Germany, of course, the bourgeoisie doesn't go along with fascism. Whatever you might think, fascism's bad for business generally. Fascism, what is best for business is a well-developed liberal democratic, preferably a republic, or if you have to have a monarch, then one that's suitably neutered. So the last thing you want is an autocrat, a despot like Hitler or Mussolini or Franco. But if it comes to having someone to go and kill the communists, that's you're prepared to. I mean, and in the context of Germany, where only 1% of the population was Jewish, the German bourgeoisie were prepared to see a few members of the Jewish bourgeoisie slaughtered, well, not even slaughtered, but in the first instance, merely dispossessed. Only the slaughter only happened later. So the support for fascism was because of the very real possibility of socialism, and the very real possibility, and of course, the real mass base for fascism, properly speaking, is either the petit bourgeoisie or the peasantry, and not even all of the peasantry, because a lot of poor peasants would have supported, for example, the CNT in the context of Spain. There is a tendency on the part of really rubbish historians to look at the context of Germany and think that somehow it was the working class was supporting Hitler. A tiny proportion of the working class supported Hitler, and we saw that actually more in the SR than the Nazi Party proper, because the SR actually made a lot of play on being anti-capitalist, but they would of course do it in the socialism of fools, as it were, and talk about Jewish capital and so on. And one of the reasons why Ernst Röhm and Gregor Strasser and all these others were killed in the Night of the Long Knives was effectively, that was Hitler saying, we're not going to be flirting with socialistic sounding ideas anymore. We're going to make sure that the bourgeoisie are completely comfortable to know that, where no one's going to touch their money, and effectively, and it sounds a weird thing to say, but the left wing of the Nazi Party was slaughtered in the Night of the Long Knives. So Ernst Röhm and Gregor Strasser and all these other people, and the few members of the SR that were it was only the leadership of the SR that was destroyed. Formerly, the SR continued to exist throughout the whole period of the Nazi rule, but increasingly, of course, they were incorporated into the German army. As unlike the SS, it was a kind of personal bodyguard for Hitler, which just grew and grew. In the context of Italy, Benito Mussolini was originally a member of the Socialist Party, a leading member of the Socialist Party, and was at one point supported by Antonio Gramsci. But in Italy, like in Germany, like in Spain, you have an impoverished peasantry, a beleaguered petty bourgeoisie caught between an industrial proletariat and a haute bourgeoisie. The haute bourgeoisie could squeeze you to the pipsqueak for loans or whatever else. And in the context of Italy, of course, you had an almost revolutionary situation in the north, in what's known as the Biennio Rosso, in Turin and whatever. So where the industrial proletariat was strongest, you had 2 red years, where there were workers' councils in the factories and that kind of thing. So it's and fascist parties are thrown up by that situation. This is why, for example, it's ridiculous to talk about Trump as a fascist. He might be a lot of things, and I could call him a lot worse things than that. But what he's not is a fascist. Yes, he's authoritarian. Yes, he's nationalist. Yes, he's disgusting in so many ways. But that doesn't make him a Nazi. It doesn't make him a fascist. And it's silly to say so, really. As pleasant as it might sound, I would call him a lot of worse things than that.
What's a fascist then? How do you define fascism?
I think I would define it in terms of that association with its base. It's a movement which is rooted in a beleaguered petty bourgeoisie and, to a certain extent, peasantry. There are some interesting anomalies. I mean, a really weird thing I read about the Nazi Party was that it had a very high proportion of doctors. A very high proportion of the medical profession were members of the Nazi Party. And I've struggled with that one for a little while. But then, so 1% of the population of Germany was Jewish, but something like 35% of the doctors in Berlin were Jewish. So the Jewish population wasn't evenly spread across Germany. They were if they weren't in business, they were in the liberal professions or in university lecturing or whatever else. And it was quite tempting to think that the reason why German doctors joined the Nazi Party was to eliminate their business rivals in the context of the urban centres. But and it's not therefore accidental, really. It wasn't the Jews weren't the first to be massacred. It was the disabled, and they were killed by their own doctors and nurses.
Communists,
or stuck in the back of an ambulance with the exhaust pipe plumbed into the inside of the ambulance.
It's also the question. It's not really the subject of today, but it is an interesting one. The fascism rising everywhere. People see it rising everywhere. It is. There's for sure and chauvinism, national chauvinism, often reactionary politics, etc., but it also has to do with the rise of the working class. That is the opposite of fascism, isn't it? It's the same side of a coin. So it's unlikely fascism will rise its head without there being a serious working class challenge from the left, which requires fascism. As you said, I think capitalism would much prefer to rule without, either extreme. It just wants to be able to do its business without having to turn to somebody like Hitler. But capitalism did turn to Hitler and supported him because the working class needed to be smashed, which is where the military wing of the fascists comes into force, isn't it? That's why a real fascist movement has a military wing in order to smash the working class, which is the only one that could stop it, or it is designed to stop the working class from the left. So that's I also don't see many fascists around at the moment, although there probably are some who love to do that kind of stuff. But it's,
I mean, and there are lots of people who like to dip into the dressing up box. I mean, if anybody remembers Franjo Tudjman in Croatia, consciously using the symbolism of the Ustashi puppet regime that was established during World War II. I mean, he sort of like wandering about in fascistic-looking uniforms and things, but it didn't mean that what happened in Croatia was fascism. And the use of symbolism is one thing, and often used for all sorts of disgusting reasons. But it doesn't necessarily equate to the same thing. That doesn't mean to say anything that we're likely to face in the future is going to be any more pleasant. I mean, they're still going to be vile, and they're still going to be lethal. But for example, when I see people talking about Netanyahu as a fascist, I think, well, we need to understand that a bit better. I mean,
absolutely. Okay, then to sum up this session, because I haven't got any hands up, Ian, how in today's society, in today's capitalism, how do you think communist socialists should engage with unions? What should our strategy be? How do we act in the trade union movement?
Only from my personal experience is that there needs to be an independent shop steward workers movement in a way that there was developing at various times. But I mean, certainly in my lifetime, in the 70s, there were independent shop stewards connections to circumvent the trade union bureaucracy. I remember very well in the 82 health workers dispute, as part of my first degree, I went out and interviewed trade union bureaucrats in what was my union at the time, the National Union of Public Employees, and the Confederation of Health Service Employees. I remember talking to I've forgotten his name now, he's long dead, a senior NUPE official, and he said, well, we didn't organise the strikes that took place among nurses. I got a phone call one day and said, we're on strike tomorrow. And that's what needs to happen, that the capacity for trade unionists to organise independently. But once somebody asked me the question, what should the attitude of communists be to trade unions? I said it should be parasitic. I think we should use the trade unions for their money, and because it's our money. You know, these parasites that are in these kind of trade union positions, they have much better lives than we do. I mean, you look at what senior officials get paid in the Royal College of Nursing or whatever, it's a bloody sight more than a staff nurse, I can tell you. And you know, they get that from their members.
Should be on the average worker's wage, right?
Oh, absolutely, and of course they'll justify it in terms of, you know, we pay our union officials what we think the workers ought to get paid. Well, no, hang on a minute. I would make sure that trade union officials get paid what the same wages as the people they represent, and if they get a pay rise for all the people they represent, then they get a pay rise and all. How about that? We have to use the trade unions until such time as we have any other kind of independent organ. But we need organisation. We can't. You know, the idea of people like Proudhon and Bakunin or whatever, that you just need the spontaneous organisation, anger of the masses, and on the basis of it's quickly dissipated, easily destroyed, and very easily infiltrated. By the way. You know, if you're going to adopt a policy of you know, smashing things up or whatever else, you can expect special branches are going to have agents in there fairly quickly. And I don't mean necessarily fully paid up professional police officers who join up to get, you know, people pregnant and whilst they go about their lawful duty. I mean, you know, they'll buy off people. They'll find people who are just pissed off and who are happy to sell out their mates for something, or just want to get one over. I mean, George Orwell informed on members of the Communist Party, and that's well documented. And you know, given if you read Homage to Catalonia, what a superb book it is in so many ways, and you realise just how committed he was. But as far as he was concerned, Stalinism was more dangerous than capitalism. So it's very easy to find someone who's disaffected to recruit as an agent, and any professional police officer is trained to do just that. Well, any professional special branch officer, I mean, the average plod.
Well, we pay our taxes, innit? Thank you very much, Ian. Great session. Comrades, next week, last session in this sub-series, we'll be looking at party building and the Bolsheviks. So we're only spending one session on that. It's going to be Ian and Kevin next week. And then we're going to move on to the history of Israel-Palestine. Hope to see you then. Thank you, Ian. Thank you, comrades. Good night.